Welcome to Ignore the Machine. I'm Bradley J., champion of the unusual, and our guest is the unusually brilliant Rich Rubino. How do you like that, Rich? And today we're going to talk about
Brilliant.
how it seems to me that presidents have more power than they used to. There seems to be a
Yep.
presidential power creep. And seeing as, or knowing that Rich Rubino is a very astute political historian, I thought there might be key points where presidential power increased. And we can talk about that now. President General Washington. It seems like he really didn't want all that much power. You know, he left before he had to. They made him come back, and it seems like since that time, the type of person who serves is different, and the desire for power has increased and the power has increased. So
Mhm.
I'll just let you take it from here.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the first document before the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation or Perpetual Union, they tried to essentially have the most slimmed down presidency possible, in part because they saw the monarch and they were trying to rebel, if you will, against the monarchy. So they had what was called the Office of President assembled. It was essentially, a lot of it was a ceremonial position. The president would sign letters. For example, there's a fellow named John Hanson from Maryland. There's a group of people that think it should actually be called the John Hanson Society, who think he's actually the first president. But it was mostly ceremonial, though he did, for example, approve the first Treasury Department, the first presidential seal. But he was basically a member of the Continental Congress, and he would essentially preside over what was really a one-branch government at the time under the Articles of Confederation. 1787, that hot summer in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there were those who wanted to keep the articles and just amend it, and those who wanted to completely obliterate it and supplant it with a new document that would give more power to the president. The Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the existing document. Patrick Henry, for example, said that the new Constitution is an awful squinting. It squints toward monarchy. And they came out with a new document, the United States Constitution, and the constitutional presidency was relatively limited. The first few presidents, you were mentioning George Washington, he did voluntarily serve only 2 terms. John Adams succeeded him, served 1 term, lost re-election. George Washington, by the way, in terms of vetoes, there is a presidential veto that some of the Anti-Federalists were very incredulous toward. George Washington would only veto legislation he viewed as constitutionally impermissible. What does that mean? If he personally does not agree with legislation, he would still sign it because he thought essentially it was Congress's prerogative. He essentially thought that the president was almost subordinate to Congress, and the president had to sign it whether he agreed with it or not based on policy. Thomas Jefferson comes in 1800, the Revolution of 1800. Thomas Jefferson talks about bringing power back to the states. He talks about an agrarian republic. He essentially believed that the president was just that, subordinate to the United States Congress. Imagine a president saying that today, that essentially they're going to be subordinate to the United States Congress. It was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828, comes in 1829, and he was the first president who actually began to veto legislation, not because of its constitutionality, but because of simply he would disagree with it. And since then, no president has not, the presidential power, essentially the precedent is, if a president agrees with legislation, he signs it. If he disagrees with it, he vetoes it. And that was because of Andrew Johnson. Interestingly, presidents used to, Thomas Jefferson, he only delivered 2 speeches his entire presidency. It used to be that presidents would not actually go out and speak and try to promote their programs. And presidents wouldn't even campaign themselves. Didn't begin that a president would actually go out there and go over the heads of the American people, which was something probably not anticipated by the United States Constitution until Andrew Johnson in 1866. What was called the Swing Around the Circle campaign, where he'd essentially go around the country and try to promote his platform. And he would try to go over the head sometimes of the United States Congress. And then you had an era after that, the Gilded Age, where executive power was relatively limited. It was really Theodore Roosevelt who comes in 1901, and he tries to expand the power of the president. He tries to make it a personal office. He uses what's called the bully pulpit. What's the bully pulpit? The bully pulpit essentially means that the president uses his office to go around to speak, to talk directly to the American people, and go over the heads of the United States Congress, to become a populist, to become almost as Andrew Jackson would call it, the People's Tribune, if you will. And since then, most presidents have expanded the presidential power in some way or another. although Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, did try to limit the size of government. He was probably the last really, I think, constitutional presidency we had. But since then, basically every president has believed that the president has, in a sense, more power than Congress. There's always been kind of an internecine battle. And believe it or not, sometimes the Congress is willing to cede their power to the presidency. For example, the Constitution says Congress shall declare war. It says Congress shall declare war right in there, but Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. It began, Harry Truman essentially got Congress to authorize what we call the police action in the Korean War. Since then, that's essentially what's happened. Presidents have just gotten Congress to authorize it, and they haven't declared war. The line item veto. The line item veto is actually which essentially would allow the president to actually veto provisions in legislation without congressional approval. He can go through a whole legislation, just simply veto what he doesn't like. Congress approved that overwhelmingly back in 1997 under Bill Clinton. But then, of course, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutionally impermissible because of the present clause in the United States Constitution. But it just shows the willingness and ableness for Congress to cede their power to the presidency. Fast-track trade authority, Congress has passed numerous times, which allows the president essentially to get Congress to vote up or down on trade legislation as opposed to being able to amend it. So Congress generally, I think, is willing to cede their power to the presidency. And there's always that trepidation that the presidency is turning from a constitutional office to essentially almost an autocracy where look at the way you look at it. When you say a president runs the country, they say, we're electing somebody to run the country. Well, no, under the Constitution, you're not. There are three co-equal branches. There's the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. And the executive is not supposed to be any more omnipotent than any of the other branches, but we view the president almost like he runs the country, and we view him more as a dictator than we do a constitutionally officer with very restricted powers.
And more recently, there's the use of executive. What's the word? They just make a statement, and that is the way things are until
executive order.
Executive order.
Yeah.
It's that way until somebody makes it otherwise. Is the executive order a recent thing, and has it been used more and more?
It has. Executive orders sometimes are simply the president going to order the agriculture secretary to do something or something to that effect. Many times they're just procedural. You never hear about them because there's really not much. There's really not much there that really matters all that much. But presidents sometimes will use them as policy, just like they use recess appointments, for example. They'll try to appoint somebody during recess to a vacant seat, for example. For example, there might be the attorney, for example, let's say this attorney general's office, and during a break when Congress isn't in session, it's an emergency, so the president has to appoint that person, for example. So that happens sometimes. Executive orders, Bill Clinton absolutely prioritized these, specifically in around 1996, 1995, when he was running for re-election. Congress, the first time in 40 years, United States Congress was controlled by Republicans. So what did he do? He would sign these executive orders, sometimes for very, very small matters, and then he would issue those executive orders. And when he'd issue those executive orders, he would do a radio address about it. So sometimes it was, I have been asked the Attorney General to look into this. I've asked the Agriculture Department to look into this, and it personalized the presidency. As opposed to the president being known for big things, these were things that were very specifically targeted to specific constituency groups. And since then, it's become an art almost for the president to kind of circumvent the Congress with that.
And I guess something that really bothers me is the power of the president to pardon. When did that become a thing, and why is it legitimate? I don't think it's legitimate because it's too easy to have these pardons be politically motivated.
That is in the United States Constitution. They do have the constitutional power to essentially pardon people for federal crimes. You saw probably the most notorious or perhaps heroic, depending on your perspective, was in 1974. Gerald Ford comes into office. He has a 70% job approval rating. People think this guy's finally going to unify the country. And he says that 25% of his day was spent essentially dealing with what's going to happen with Richard Nixon, his unpopular predecessor. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to his papers? What's going to happen to him? Will he go to trial? So he decided that he would issue him a full and unconditional pardon for everything that happened during his presidency. What happened? His job approval went all the way from 70% right down precipitously to 48%. He never recovered that and landed up losing re-election in a razor-tight election to Jimmy Carter in 1976. But later in life, actually, the Kennedy Center awarded him essentially an award, with Ted Kennedy saying at the time, "I was wrong, and he should have issued the pardon and unify the country." The other side of that is there are many other Nixon aides who were actually who were not pardoned, who actually did land up serving time in jail. So there was kind of an unequal distribution there, if you will. Richard Nixon, there was some thought he was sick. He would die if he was not pardoned, if he was spending his time in jail. Nixon, by all accounts, would actually ask Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, what it would be like if he was in jail. He was trying to essentially determine whether he could actually live his term in jail, or his ex-presidency, a couple of years essentially in jail. That's probably the most famous, but you've had other ones. George H.W. Bush, his last days in office, December 24th, 1992, right before he was leaving, he pardoned Caspar Weinberg and others involved in the Iran-Contra affair involving his predecessor, Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton, his last day in office, pardoned Susan McDougal, who was one of his business partners in the Whitewater affair. He also pardoned Mark Rich, who was a fugitive from justice, and and his wife had given money to the Clinton Library. This created a complete brouhaha. Folks like Arlen Specter, the senator from Pennsylvania, was saying we should impeach him. There was a former president, Barney Frank, a supporter of Bill Clinton, was up in arms about this. It kind of seeded its way to the pages of history. You've got other ones that are kind of more innocuous. For example, Willie McCovey, the baseball player for the Giants, was pardoned on the last days by Barack Obama for some financial misdealings that he had. Donald Trump pardoned Roger Stone, and Rob Blagojevich. Rob Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois. Remember him with the hair?
Oh, yeah.
Donald Trump pardoned him, but he fired him on Celebrity Apprentice. So Donald Trump was trying to make up for that. So he pardoned Rob Blagojevich when he was president. Rob Blagojevich said, I'm a rarity. He's a Democrat for Trump now. But he also pardoned others. There's always lots of pardons that you never hear about. Bill Clinton actually pardoned his brother Roger his last day in office for cocaine offenses. When, by the way, you know who the prosecutor was who prosecuted Roger Clinton back in '84?
Robert Mueller.
Asa Hutchinson.
Oh, really?
The one, he was a prosecutor at the time. The guy who used to be the drug czar, was a congressman from Northwest Arkansas. He was governor of Arkansas, and now he's a presidential candidate. He was the person who prosecuted Roger Clinton back in 1984. And if you read Bill Clinton's memoir, My Life, he said that he thinks that Asa Hutchinson inadvertently actually probably saved Roger Clinton's life. But the president certainly has this power, and it certainly is in the Constitution. The only way you can get rid of it would be a constitutional amendment, which is a virtual infinitesimal uncertainty.
So what was the purpose of it? Was there there must have been a clear and present need for it back then? Was there somebody that needed pardoning back then?
It wasn't a specific person. It was more, they were looking at, first of all, the possibility that someone was simply wronged by the courts, that there was a sentence that was just insubstantial, or that there's somebody who was really innocent, that the president somehow, or the president would simply have mercy on somebody who served their time, was in there for good behavior, and the president thought that that person essentially was rejuvenated and could be part of society, that they had served their time, but there was no real kind of otherwise there would be no mechanism, and that person would have to serve their entire time in prison for potentially something that, say an overzealous judge sentencing for something to that effect. And that does happen. You do see presidents pardoning people that you've never heard of, and they get virtually no coverage. It's when they pardon somebody that's really known, like a Susan McDougal, for example, or a Mark Rich, or a Caspar Weinberg, or a Roger Stone, or Rob Blagojevich, then it's going to make headlines. By the way, there's one more fascinating one. Fife Symington, a very conservative Republican governor of Arizona, was pardoned on the last day by Bill Clinton. Now, here's why this is fascinating. Bill Clinton, there was a riptide, and Bill Clinton was once, when he was a student, he was in the water, and a riptide was taking him out to sea, and Fife Symington ran into the water and saved Bill Clinton's life. Bill Clinton probably would not be alive were it not for the Republican governor. So Fife Symington, when he was governor of Arizona, ran into some trouble. He landed up getting getting a huge sentence, and it was Bill Clinton who returned the favor by pardoning the Republican governor of Arizona who had saved his life back when he was in his 20s.
Back to executive order, Joe. I call him my friend from the MBTA. Well, he's not really from the MBTA. Anyway, Joe says, didn't Teddy Roosevelt create the national park system by executive order?
I believe it was.
I don't know.
Began by Ulysses S. Grant in 1871. He established the first national park. The whole national park system, I believe, was passed by Congress, but there was a Republican Congress at the time. You'd have to check that, but I believe it was Congress that.
Teddy Roosevelt was big on national parks, though. I thought it was Ted. Huh? No, huh?
Well, Grant started the process of. He was the one who established the Yellowstone Park, for example, back in 1871. Harrison comes in 1888, 1889. He established some national parks, but it was Roosevelt that really kind of took this to an exponent. He proliferated, and he created this. He created basically. If you think of anything under Roosevelt, think of anything today, it's he expanded presidential power exponentially, and he certainly what he did in terms of national parks. And also what he did in terms of using the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was signed by Benjamin Harrison in 1891, and he used that power to essentially try to regulate trust. He would take on J.P. Morgan at one time, for example, but that was really power that Theodore Roosevelt used, and those are probably the three things people remember him, if anything, from his 7.5 years as president.
By the way, Joe. The last broadcast I did, my microphone, you couldn't hear me very well. Is my sound okay today, Joe, or anybody? Now, has the notion that a president can pardon himself actually been tested?
No.
Can a president pardon themselves?
No, and that's really a constitutional question. Some think that potentially because of the 14th Amendment, if they've been involved in insurrection, that is a crime that essentially they cannot pardon themselves for. They probably cannot pardon themselves for a non-federal crime.
Why should they be able to pardon themselves for any crime? It's ridiculous.
Because they are essentially they are president on the one hand. It's like Cy Sperling used to say, I'm not only the Hair Club president, but I'm also a client. Remember that?
Of course.
The Hair Club for Men, and he'd have that because he was essentially.
I remember.
You remember it, yes. Well, Donald Trump's very much the same way. He's not only the president, he would not say, I'm not only the president of the United States, but I'm also a citizen. So therefore, just like Cy Sperling being a Hair Club president and also a client, he would say, I can pardon myself as a citizen because I'm also a private citizen. So
I would say that,
if you will.
I would argue that goes against the spirit of the law. And
probably not what the founders are probably not thinking it. But it's very much a constitutional loophole, if you will. It's a loophole because it does not specifically say that a president cannot pardon him or herself.
So is that something the Supreme Court needs to take up?
It probably would, but I would say that depending on what the charges were, as I say, if it's for an insurrection, then they're very much 14th Amendment constitutional questions. However, if it's for something else, if it's for another federal crime, for example, then it's hard to me to see where that is constitutionally impermissible. It may be ethically impermissible, it may be unscrupulous, but from a pure, cold, hard-boiled, calculated constitutional perspective, I believe it's probably constitutionally permissible for a president to pardon him or herself for a federal crime.
Well, a judge wouldn't oversee a case about themselves, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I hope that somebody gets on the ball and makes a decent argument against anybody, any president, Clinton, whoever, pardoning themselves.
Although I guess on that same analogy, a lawyer theoretically could represent themselves.
Yeah, they could. I don't think that's different because they're not the decider.
As a citizen, they could play the role as lawyer, and they could play the role as citizen representing themselves indirectly as well.
Yeah, but we all know that people can represent themselves, but they're not the decider. They're their advocate.
Right.
It's different. They're not the judge.
I guess it's like in a softball game when the it's like a softball game when the team that's The team that's on defense is making the decision, is deciding whether somebody's safe or out. They probably
Yeah,
have
that's right.
self-interest there.
Jesus, that's just on the face of it wrong and needs to be fixed. That's all right. Very good. And finally on this presidential increase of presidential power, it's way too much power for one man.
And very much so. And as I say, the constitutional presidency was very much
or person, I should say, one person.
Yes, it was very much limited. The issue is presidents have taken the power, and it really began with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson taking that veto power, as was aforementioned. He says, I'm going to use that veto power not because I think something's unconstitutional. I'm going to veto things because I personally don't like it. Since then, every president has essentially taken that on. But most presidents essentially want to aggrandize themselves, their power, their office, and they all want legacies. And if you want to have a legacy, it's probably not the best thing to be what many Gilded Age presidents who are very much not remembered as is somebody as what Grover Cleveland would call a guardian president. What's a guardian president? So in 1893, there's a panic of 1893. There's a Great Depression, 19% employment. People are coming all over the country saying, please, Mr. President, we want you to do something. Use your power, please, Mr. President. Grover Cleveland says, no, under the Constitution, I'm a guardian president. Congress has more power than I do, so I'm going to do virtually nothing to try to alleviate the Great Depression. So what happens? 1894, the Democrats lose about 134 seats. No party's lost that many seats in American history. And in 1896, the Democrats choose William Jennings Bryan, who's completely different than Grover Cleveland. But the point is, Grover Cleveland supported that constitutional presidency. So as a result, when you think of Grover Cleveland, the only thing perhaps most people think about is, wasn't that guy that served 2 consecutive terms? Isn't he the one that screwed up the number? But you don't think much about Grover Cleveland. But when you think about presidents that we remember, it's usually the presidents who've used their power. Abraham Lincoln, he suspended habeas corpus, for example, when he was in there. He, that was constitutionally dubious. You look at Theodore Roosevelt, you look at the way he took on the trust, you look at the presidents you remember, you look at Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt did everything he could to aggrandize the power. He even tried a Supreme Court packing plan where all justices over 70, for every justice under 70, the president could nominate another justice to serve, which obviously would be more constitutionally compliant to Franklin Roosevelt's agenda. And you continue to see this. You see Truman sending troops to South Korea without congressional declaration of war. You see President Johnson doing the same with Vietnam, the Gulf War. You see George W. Bush doing it with Iraq. But I think presidents that are remembered positively or negatively are usually the ones who use their power. And oftentimes, by the way, when we're at war, when the country is at war, Americans are very much forgiving of presidents not acting as constitutional professors, not using the letter of the law. All of a sudden, things become popular. Franklin Roosevelt, for example, probably never would have been able to establish the Japanese internment program, where they essentially brought Japanese Americans to the middle of the country to internment camps, if it wasn't for the fact that the nation was involved in war. George W. Bush would never have gotten the Patriot Act through, but he got it through right after 9/11 because Americans were very much in a rally around the flag effect, if you will. Lyndon Johnson got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. It went past unanimously, 416-0 in the United States House of Representatives, in part because the United States was allegedly attacked by North Vietnam, or at least a ship was allegedly attacked. So once we're at war, I think there's a lot of sympathies. People rally around the commander-in-chief, not the United States Congress. And I look back to the Iraq War, for example. Before in 2000, George W. Bush was running for president. He said we need a more humble foreign policy. Then 9/11 happens. He goes into Afghanistan, has unanimous support in the United States Senate. Only Barbara Lee of California votes against him. He has authorization of the use of force. To do that, he uses that same authorization, goes into Iraq. Iraq's overwhelmingly popular at the beginning. People who were against the Iraq War were seen almost as traitorous. Only 22 members of the Senate voted against it. Half the House of Representatives of the Democratic caucus voted for it. So when we're at war, Congress definitely tends to genuflect to the president.
Okay, and now, former President Trump has said that he will dramatically increase the power of the president if he is elected in 2024. Do you have a handle on what he's trying to do? Is he trying to circumvent congressional approval of things?
Well, if he does that, I mean, obviously Congress can do everything they can to try to stop him. A congressman could try to bring him to court, essentially, because he'd need legislation in many respects. If he's saying,
can either branch do that, or does it have to be one or the other?
The president can't bring the Congress to court.
No, can the House or the Senate do that? Either one?
They can petition. Yes, they can bring. Yes, they could do this, and that the reason I'm mentioning is because back in 1997, it was an individual. It was essentially, it has to be a case. What happened in 1997? It was Robert Byrd from West Virginia brought the Clinton administration to court, and actually the court ruled that the line item veto was unconstitutional. So that's certainly one example. The president cannot, as an individual, bring the Congress to court, but the Congress could say something essentially is unconstitutional. Try to bring it to court. There'd have to be a reason, by the way. In '97, in the case, there was actually some people there were some social programs in Idaho, for example, when a program was cut, and the program was cut, the people involved in that program brought it, they petitioned it, and they got it all the way to the Supreme Court, and then they had supporters in the United States Senate. So it was more to that effect. But you need to have a reason. You need to have somebody who is directly affected by it, and that would be an issue because someone's going to say, well, I'm an American citizen, so I'm going to bring it to the United States Supreme Court, something to that effect. Karamatsu's case, for example, during World War II, it was actually a guy named Fred. That was his name. That shows American he was. His name was Fred Karamatsu. He was the person who brought his internment to the United States Supreme Court, in which case the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutionally permissible for him to essentially, and all of his coefficients and his family and everyone else, to be interned. But you have to have somebody who's directly affected by it, which wouldn't be too hard to get.
What do you think's going to happen? Each week changes. What's going to happen? Will Republicans hold on to the House? They have a pretty thin majority. What are they going to lose that by acting crazy, or are they going to gain by acting crazy?
Well, there are 18 members of the House of Representatives right now who represent districts where Joe Biden won in 2020, and there's only five Democrats who represent districts where Donald Trump won in 2020. There are those that are called the 18, and those are the ones that the Democrats rather, are really going to go after, and they're going to end with Donald Trump as their nominee. That's their dream, because Donald Trump is unpopular generally in the country, and certainly in their Pacific congressional districts. Donald Trump will be an albatross. They're going to have to run against Donald Trump as much as they possibly can, because these are members. Obviously, the fact that Joe Biden won their congressional district shows that shows how unpopular Donald Trump is, and then you take to that the fact that there's going to be a galvanization on the Democratic side, not necessarily for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's more kind of the de facto Democrat, but certainly against Donald Trump. And I would say the odds right now are that the Democrats pick up the House of Representatives just because of just simply numerically. There are just so many. Part of it, there are so many. Every moderate Democrat has pretty much been wiped out. The Blue Dog Caucus had about 65 members at one time. Now they literally, how many they have? The Blue Dogs are like moderate and conservative Democrats. They have 9. And they're basically not even Southern Democrats. The chairman is somebody from Maine, somebody from Alaska, someone from Washington. These are the people that run the Blue Dog Democrats right now. So you're basically at just about bare bones of Democrats that can get elected. The reason I say there are only 5 is they're basically elected from congressional districts that have been so gerrymandered that essentially it's very hard for those Democrats to lose, except losing in a primary. And if they lose in a primary, a Democrat's still going to represent that person, going to represent that constituency. On the Republican side, though, there is definitely some room to play with, and folks and the Republicans. I think there are going to be some vulnerable Republicans. Now, if Donald Trump's not the nominee, if it's someone that can neutralize the situation, like Tim Scott, for example, then I think the Republicans probably have a better chance of retaining the House. But as you said, it's razor thin, and there's a reason that George Santos is still in the House of Representatives, because Kevin McCarthy knows that that's a district that's likely to go. That's one of those 18 members. It's the district that's likely to go for the Democrats, and he has to be able to keep his power, even though from a public relations standpoint, it's an absolute iniquitous nightmare.
All right, one other thing about presidents. Up till pretty recently, it was my understanding that if a president was convicted of a federal crime, they could not serve. And now I'm told they can. What's the truth on that?
Yeah, my understanding is they can. They can serve if they've been convicted, and they can serve probably if they have been convicted and are serving time. So theoretically, you could have a president serving in the penitentiary, being president of the United States, and the Secret Service, because the Secret Service has to protect a former president. They could theoretically be serving time for a crime they did not commit while the president of the United States is sitting in a prison cell.
Yeah, that's the notion that a convicted president can serve seems really hypocritical, because is it not true that if you're convicted of a felony, you cannot vote?
Yeah, he couldn't vote. They could not. The president could not vote for themselves. Correct.
No, like if you were convicted of a felony, you can no longer vote. Is that true?
I know that in many states they've changed that. In some states, if you've been, not when you're in prison, but if you come out, then in some states you are allowed to vote. Once you're out, it depends on, essentially, I believe it depends on the state. I know Virginia, for example.
Well, that would be weird if people couldn't vote for being convicted, but the president could serve for being convicted. That would be hypocritical. It's just when it comes right down to it, in the general election, I can't see anyone who did not vote for Trump before decide,
right.
since that last election, I just love the guy. I loved January 6th, and I love the fake elector scheme, and I love him saying he's going to exact his retribution during. I didn't vote for him before, but now I voted for Joe Biden before, but now I'm changing my vote. I can't see anybody changing from Trump to Joe Biden.
That's what I think the Republicans' biggest fear is, that Donald Trump essentially
he maxed out.
He has a ceiling, and it's very hard for people to see him getting over, say, 44% of the popular vote. Almost everybody has an opinion on Donald Trump, whether you like him, don't like him, whether you're a low propensity voter or a high propensity voter. People have a visceral reaction toward Donald Trump. And in order to win elections, generally, certainly, yes, you consolidate the base, but there's also about 10% that are usually persuadable voters. They're extremely elusive, but you have to go for those persuadable voters. I don't really see somebody that's kind of in the center that says, well, I don't know if I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. I could vote for Donald Trump. Potentially, by the way, if there's a third party, if No Labels nominates Joe Manchin as his nominee, and then has John Huntsman Jr., the former governor of Utah and ambassador to China, as their running mate, I think there might be some people who would just say, I'm just disgusted with the whole process. I can't believe these two were nominated. They would have safe haven and potentially could go to that person, which would really be a wild card. But it's hard for me to see somebody that's kind of in the center right now. It's either you like Donald Trump or you don't Donald Trump, or in many respects, either you absolutely believe there's no God but Donald Trump, or you believe that Donald Trump is the Antichrist.
If he is reelected, do you feel like certain government agencies like the military will kind of just say, you know what, we're going to operate kind of by ourselves? We're not going to necessarily do what the president says because of who he is.
I don't think so. I think that there might be some in the military high command who potentially would want to do that. I don't know what, for example, if with someone like a Mark Milley or someone that's in the military establishment that's supposed to be non-political. Do you follow orders from what you believe to be an unlawful?
I don't think you're supposed to. I actually don't think you're supposed to. Right?
No, you're not. No, you're
okay.
Not.
So
theoretically, what can you do? Other than short of resignation, if you decide I'm not going to follow an unlawful order, I don't know what the recourse is. What you essentially could do. I do not see a scenario where the military just says we're not going to follow the president's orders. But also remember, the president is not solely superintendent of the military. The Congress too. Congress has power to clear war. Congress does appropriation, so the president is not in this by himself. The president cannot simply say, you know what, I'm going to send 700,000 troops and we're going to go and we're going to invade Eritrea today. I mean, there's a whole process for that.
No, but if there's an emergency, then he can.
That's where it says he's the commander in chief. And with commander in chief, right? If the United States, for example, if we see that let's say let's say China has troops and they're bringing them into Guam, and someone says, "Mr. President, can you send troops in there to protect?" He can. In that case, yes, he can.
So, does the president, speaking of presidential power, we know President Trump is very friendly and admires Putin and sides with Russia. If he becomes president, does he have the power to just say, you know what, take Ukraine, we're done? Does he have that power?
Well, he doesn't have the power because he's not president of Russia. But what he can do is
if we cease to support them, then he gets Ukraine.
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, yes. If he says, you know what, I mean, now theoretically though, Congress could pass an appropriation. I mean, this isn't going to happen because it's a Republican. This probably will not happen. But they could override the president. They could pass something. The president could veto it, and they could override the veto if there was an overwhelming support for the Ukrainian government. If the president says, you know what, I'm not going to support the Ukrainians anymore. We're not going to send them anything anymore, and Congress passes them something. He says, all right, I'm going to veto it. Then theoretically, Congress could override it.
All right. So we have a new. Jim, I don't know if it's IGO or EGO. I'm going to go with IGO, but tell me if I'm wrong. Trumpism defined. Generally, Rich Rubino and I don't make this a referendum on Trump, but this is a comment. I'll allow it. Trumpism defined. Money addiction is an unhealthy dependence on money. Some signs of money addiction are gambling. I don't know if gambling. I don't know if I agree with you, Jim. I don't think gambling is a money addiction thing. I mean, people end up with less of it. It's more of a thrill addiction, I think. But anyway, overspending, again, is okay, maybe. But I would think frugality would be closer to a money addiction. We could argue that. Excessive saving, there. The signs of money addiction: living in a denial, obsessing over obtaining more money. Do you have it? How do you know so much about it, Jim? These signs can also portray themselves in habits such as the inability to change, unhealthy money habits, self-image and self-worth of the person tied to the amount of money they have, etc. Okay, so I'm guessing, he says Trumpism is defined as money addiction. And what do you think? I mean, yes, the president has really, and the family really monetized the office, but is that his guiding thing? I don't know if it's more than, I think it's more an extreme fear of losing in any game, any way, any kind of losing. I believe his father beat into him, probably metaphorically beat into him, that losing is death. And it's more about losing, less about money. But let's see what you have to say there, Rich Rubino.
I don't think money's the main driver. I mean, certainly it's something he's always had. It's not something he's ever had to deal. Not many times people that become wealthy later in life, if they had to deal without money when they were a lad, for example, they always had that feeling, what happens if I go broke? Will I be living under a bridge? That thing. I don't think that's Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is about a couple things. One of them is obviously power. The other is prestige. And the reason I say this, and it's also immortality. It's one thing he did when he was president, is supposedly he went to Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota, the Republican governor.
Oh God, yeah.
And he said essentially, how would I go about getting my face constructed on Mount Rushmore? So why is that relevant? It's extremely relevant because it shows what he wants. He wants to be a president to be genuflected. He doesn't want to be remembered. And I think he cares what he's remembered of. He cares what people think about him. He cares what he's thought of in history. And he wants him to be somebody like, for example, you go like almost like someone like a Gandhi, or someone that potentially is on currency, someone that generations will remember. I think that's why he talks about how he's the greatest president. Now, I've done more for African Americans than any president since Honest Abe, for example. And he talks about his legacy. And the reason is because I think he sees himself in that light. He sees himself almost like an Alexander the Great. He wants to be remembered. And I think more than anything else, that's what it is. And during his time, he wants people to absolutely love him. That's why on January 6th, for example, supposedly he wanted to go back to the Capitol because he absolutely loved the idea that he would see people that absolutely fawn over him, that genuflect to him, that believe he is kind of a demigod in that respect. Why did he do rallies when he was president? Rallies is something usually you do when you're running for president. You do rallies, and then once you're president,
except that even when you're president, you are running for president.
when you're president, usually what you do, they're not campaign rallies. What you do when you see this, Joe Biden, for example, he just spoke about Bidenomics yesterday. He went to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Why does he go there? Because it's a swing state, and he can use essentially taxpayers' money to get to make an appearance in a swing state, but doing it for his public, essentially for his job. That's why you don't see Joe Biden spending a lot of time doing these types of events in Idaho, because he's not going to win Idaho, or Vermont, because he's obviously going to win Vermont. So they do this it's kind of circumlocution, if you will. But Donald Trump, they would be campaign events, and the Republican Party would be paying for them, and he would barnstorm the country, and he would do rallies while he was president. He loves that. He loves that attention. He likes that, and I think he probably likes that, and it's probably even superlative to him than his bank account, than the money he has. That's
interesting. So, do you think? And I know I'm stringing this out. If he is the nominee, there will be a Republican bloodbath, that down ballot races will suffer, or not so much.
Yeah, I do. That's why I think specifically those 18 members who represent districts where Joe Biden won, they have this big problem. On the one hand, if they completely disassociate themselves from Donald Trump, then Donald Trump's backers, the benefactors, are going to close their checkbook, and they're going to say, well, he's not one of us. I'm not going to give him the money. On the other hand, if they essentially tether or allegate themselves, co-op, they try to they say, I'm going to be a Donald Trump type Republican, then those persuadable voters, those moderate Democrats who potentially voted for them because they like them on local issues, but they're also the ones who are going to vote for a Democrat in other elections, are going to say, he's just going to be a carbon copy of Donald Trump. He's not going to think for himself, so I'm going to vote against him. So you're in a rock behind in a hard place, and it's very, very hard for those Republicans, the ones that are going to run with him and talk about how great he is, almost overwhelmingly, and these include the 45 members of the Freedom Caucus, with some exceptions like Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, come from districts that are overwhelmingly Republican, and the only possible way that they're going to lose an election is in a primary. The only way someone like Kevin McCarthy in Bakersfield, California, the minority leader, he's not going to lose to a Democrat. He's going to lose, if he ever loses his reelection, and there have been folks like Steve Bannon talked about primarying him. Basically, the argument, he hasn't been loyal enough to Trump. So as a result, someone comes from the right wing of the Republican Party, runs in a primary, and defeats Kevin McCarthy. There's a word for it. It's called cantor. Why is it called cantor? Because in 2014, Eric Cantor was the House Majority Leader, likely to become John Boehner's successor as Speaker of the House. He was running for re-election, didn't campaign much for re-election. All of a sudden, this guy named David Brat runs to his right, and he defeats him in his Richmond area, his suburban Richmond area and district, because essentially he said that Cantor was too moderate, was working too much with the Obama administration. So that's essentially the predicament we're in right now.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Save something for next time. Show us your book.
Oh,
the great. Say it.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids.
Yeah, it's cool, man. And where are you gonna be?
This week I'll be in. Let's see. I'll be in Acton, Mass. Speaking at the. This week I'll be at Acton, Mass. Speaking in a group. Oh no, Lincoln, Mass. Rather, speaking in a group called the Commons, which is a senior center.
Oh, that's cool. And folks, I would love it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel, Bradley J. Travel. Most recent trip was to Jerusalem. It was not a religious pilgrimage in any way. It was, it's the center of all history, really. And it's just so, I'm fascinated by tribalism. And this is a swirling hurricane of tribalism with not only main tribes, but factions of tribes. Many of those tribes have their own garb. The most extreme factions of these tribes swirling around in this hurricane. It's fun to sit in the eye of that hurricane in the quiet, sipping a tea, seeing that go on. And so I have posted 4 videos so far. Also, if you don't follow me here on any of these platforms that you're seeing this on, please do that too. So thanks a lot, as always. Rich Rubino. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Okay, bye. Boom.